August 14, 1986. Margaret Marsh walked back into her kitchen for less than 3 minutes. When she returned to her backyard in Dunsmuir, California, her 3-year-old triplets were gone. Vanished. No screams. No struggle. Just silence where laughter had been moments before. For 40 years she never stopped looking. Never stopped believing they were out there somewhere. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in 2026, there was a knock at her door that would shatter everything she thought she knew about that day. This is the story of how one mother's nightmare became her impossible miracle. The morning of August 14, 1986, smelled like cut grass and wildflowers. Margaret Marsh stood in her kitchen, watching through the window as her triplets chased each other in circles around the oak tree. Evan wore red shoes. Ethan wore blue. Ella wore yellow. That was the only way most people could tell them apart. She'd made their favorite lunch, peanut butter sandwiches with the crusts cut off, apple slices arranged in a little pile, and juice boxes she'd bought on sale at the grocery store the day before. The lavender blanket was already spread out under the tree waiting for them. Thomas, her husband, had left before dawn for his construction job 2 towns over. Money was tight. It always was. But they were happy. The kind of happy that doesn't need much beyond a backyard, some sunshine, and the sound of children laughing. Margaret grabbed the sunscreen from the counter. Summer in Northern California could be brutal, and Ella's fair skin burned easily. She turned away from the window for just a moment, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3, to search for it in the bathroom cabinet. That's when everything changed. When she came back outside, basket in hand and sunscreen tucked under her arm, the yard was empty. The blanket lay untouched. The gate at the side of the house stood wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Margaret's heart didn't race at first. Kids wander. Kids play hide and seek. She called their names, expecting giggles from behind the bushes. Evan? Ethan? Ella? Nothing. She walked to the gate, peered down the street. Old Mrs. Henderson was watering her roses across the way. Mr. Patterson was washing his truck. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Have you seen my kids? Margaret's voice cracked as she called out. Mrs. Henderson looked up, confused. Weren't they just in your yard? That's when the fear hit. Cold and sharp and suffocating. Margaret ran back inside and called the police. Her hands shook so badly she could barely dial. By the time the operator answered, she was already crying. Within an hour, Dunsmuir transformed from a sleepy town into chaos. Police cars lined the street. Officers knocked on every door. Neighbors formed search parties and combed through the nearby woods, calling 3 names over and over until their voices went hoarse. Bloodhounds were brought in. They picked up the children's scent at the gate, followed it down the sidewalk for about 2 blocks, then lost it completely near the old highway. As if the triplets had simply vanished into thin air. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping through the afternoon heat. News vans arrived by evening. Margaret's face appeared on television screens across California, a young mother with hollow eyes and trembling hands, begging whoever took her children to bring them home. Thomas drove back at breakneck speed when he heard. He burst through the front door, wild-eyed and desperate, demanding answers no one could give. The police questioned him just like they questioned everyone. Standard procedure. But there was nothing standard about any of this. By nightfall, despite hundreds of volunteers and every resource the county could muster, not a single trace of Evan, Ethan, or Ella had been found. No witnesses. No evidence. No leads. Just 3 children, erased from existence in the time it takes to find a bottle of sunscreen. The FBI arrived the next morning. They interviewed Margaret and Thomas separately, together, then separately again. They searched the house top to bottom. They analyzed the gate, the yard, the street. They built profiles and timelines and theories. But none of it brought the triplets home. Within days, Dunsmuir became a town of suspicion. Everyone looked at everyone differently. The man who lived alone at the end of Pine Street. The teenager who'd been arrested for shoplifting last year. The family that had just moved in from out of state. But one name kept coming up in whispered conversations. Howard Kettering. Howard lived on the outskirts of town in a weathered farmhouse surrounded by tall pines. He was in his 60s, kept to himself, and had a reputation for being odd. He collected dolls, porcelain ones with glass eyes that stared from every window of his home. When he did venture into town, he'd talk to himself, muttering about innocence and purity and things that made no sense to anyone listening. The police brought him in for questioning. He sat in that interrogation room for 6 hours, smiling that strange, distant smile and speaking in riddles. "Children are precious," he said. "Pure. Before the world ruins them." "Did you take Margaret Marsh's children?" "I appreciate beauty. I preserve it." "That's not an answer." "Isn't it?" They searched his property. Found rooms full of dolls, journals filled with rambling philosophical thoughts about innocence, and photographs of children clipped from old newspapers and magazines. But nothing concrete. No evidence linking him to the triplets. No DNA. No witnesses. Nothing that would hold up in court. They had to let him go. The town never forgave that. For years, people would cross the street to avoid Howard Kettering. Parents warned their children to stay away from his property. Someone spray-painted "Child Snatcher" on his mailbox and no one bothered to clean it off. But Margaret knew in her gut. She knew he had something to do with it. She could feel it every time she saw him at the grocery store, shuffling through the aisles with that eerie smile on his face. She just couldn't prove it. Thomas left 6 months after the triplets disappeared. He didn't say goodbye. Margaret woke up one morning to find a note on the kitchen table. "I can't stay in this house anymore. I can't look at their empty beds. I'm sorry." She didn't blame him. Grief breaks people in different ways. His way was to run. Hers was to stay. To keep searching. To refuse to let go. The years passed like a slow, agonizing blur. Margaret worked as a waitress at the diner on Main Street. She kept the triplets' bedroom exactly as it was. Toys on the shelves, tiny clothes folded in drawers, 3 small beds with faded cartoon sheets. Every night, she'd stand in the doorway and whisper goodnight to ghosts. Every August 14th, on the anniversary of their disappearance, she'd place 3 candles by the gate and light them at dusk. She'd speak their names into the wind, hoping somehow they'd hear her. Hoping they'd know she never stopped looking. The town slowly forgot. New families moved in. Old ones moved away. The missing posters faded and fell from telephone poles. The news stopped covering the story. The FBI closed the case and filed it away with thousands of others. But Margaret never forgot. She couldn't. Those 3 minutes in the bathroom had stolen her entire life. She joined support groups for parents of missing children. She attended vigils. She kept a scrapbook of every article, every lead, every theory. She called the police every few months, asking if there were any updates. There never were. People started to pity her. Then they started to avoid her. The woman who couldn't move on. The woman still living in 1986 while everyone else moved forward into 1990, 1995, 2000. Howard Kettering died in 1994. Margaret stood at the edge of his funeral. Only 5 people showed up, and felt nothing. No relief. No closure. Just the same gnawing emptiness she'd carried for 8 years. His property was sold to a developer who planned to tear down the farmhouse and build condos. But the project stalled, funds ran out, and the house sat abandoned for decades. Kids told stories about it being haunted. Teenagers dared each other to break in and explore. Margaret drove past it sometimes, staring at the dark windows, wondering what secrets had died with Howard Kettering. 40 years is a long time to carry hope. By 2026, Margaret Marsh was 73 years old. Her hair had turned silver. Her hands had developed arthritis. She moved slower, spoke softer, but her eyes still held that searching quality, always scanning crowds, always looking for 3 faces she knew she'd never see again. Most people assumed she'd given up. She let them think that. It was easier than explaining that hope doesn't die. It just changes shape. It becomes quieter. More painful. A constant ache you learn to live with. She'd retired from the diner 5 years earlier. Now she spent her days in the small house that had once been filled with laughter. She'd finally packed up the triplets' room, not because she'd accepted they were gone, but because keeping it frozen in time hurt too much. On Sunday, October 13, 2026, Margaret sat in her living room with a cup of tea, flipping through television channels. a charity marathon in Portland, Oregon, a cooking show, a nature documentary. She was about to turn off the TV when something on the screen made her freeze. The marathon footage showed runners crossing the finish line. The camera panned across the crowd of exhausted, jubilant participants. And there, among hundreds of faces, were three men running side by side. Triplets. Margaret's teacup slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. Hot liquid soaked into the carpet, but she didn't notice. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't look away. The men were in their 40s. Tall, dark curly hair. Identical in every way except for the colors of their running shoes. One red, one blue, one yellow. Just like she dressed them that morning 40 years ago. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She fumbled for the remote, rewound the footage, watched it again. And again. And again. Tears streamed down her face as she studied their features. The shape of their eyes. The way they smiled. The way they moved. It was impossible. She knew it was impossible. 40 years had passed. The chances of her children being alive, let alone appearing on a random marathon broadcast, were astronomical. But a mother knows. Deep in her bones, in the place where logic can't reach, Margaret knew she was looking at her children. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and took picture after picture of the television screen. Then she called the Dunsmuir Police Department. The officer who answered Margaret's call was polite but skeptical. She'd heard it all before, the elderly woman who'd never stopped looking, who saw her missing children in every crowd. It was heartbreaking but not uncommon. Grief plays tricks on the mind. But something about Margaret's voice made her pause. A clarity. A certainty. So she forwarded the information to Detective Elena Ruiz, the department's specialist in cold cases. Elena was 42, brilliant, and possessed a stubbornness that made her perfect for unsolved mysteries. She'd only been 7 years old when the Marsh Triplets disappeared, but she remembered the case. Everyone in Dunsmuir did. It had become local legend, the cautionary tale parents told their children about never talking to strangers, never wandering off. She pulled the old case files and spread them across her desk. 40 years of dead ends. Hundreds of tips that led nowhere. Witness statements that contradicted each other. And at the center of it all, three little faces staring out from a family photograph. Elena watched the marathon footage Margaret had recorded. She froze it, enhanced it, zoomed in on the three men's faces. Then she pulled up age progression photos the FBI had created years ago, what Evan, Ethan, and Ella might look like as adults. The resemblance was striking. Not conclusive, but striking enough to warrant investigation. She contacted the Portland Marathon organizers and requested the registration list. It took 2 days and 3 different people before she got what she needed. 3 names jumped out at her. Evan Palmer, Ethan Palmer, Eric Palmer. Triplet brothers. Listed age 43. Registered address, Salem, Oregon. Elena's pulse quickened. She cross-referenced the names with adoption records. And there it was. The Palmer triplets had been adopted in 1987 by Robert and Linda Palmer, a childless couple from Eugene. According to the paperwork, the boys had been found abandoned outside a Sacramento hospital in late 1986, approximately 4 months after the Marsh triplets vanished. No identification. No explanation. Just 3 terrified toddlers who couldn't or wouldn't tell anyone their names or where they'd come from. The social worker who'd processed their case was named Helen Kramer. Elena typed the name into the database and her blood ran cold. Helen Kramer had disappeared in 1988. Her car had been found abandoned near the California-Oregon border. No body was ever recovered. The case had been classified as a likely homicide, but with no evidence and no leads, it had gone cold. Elena stared at her computer screen for a long time. Pieces of a 40-year-old puzzle were starting to fit together in ways that Elena drove to Salem on a gray October morning. The Palmer brothers lived in a modest neighborhood, the kind of place where people mowed their lawns on weekends and waved to their neighbors. She knocked on the door of Evan Palmer's house. He answered with a coffee mug in his hand and a confused smile. "Can I help you?" Elena showed her badge. "I'm Detective Ruiz from Dunsmuir, California. I need to speak with you and your brothers about something that happened a long time ago. The smile faded. What's this about? It's about where you came from. Evan called his brothers. Ethan lived 2 streets over. Eric lived across town. Within an hour, all 3 were sitting in Evan's living room, looking at Elena with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. She showed them the marathon footage. Then she showed them a photograph of Margaret Marsh from 1986, holding 3 toddlers in her lap. 3 toddlers who looked exactly like them. This woman believes you're her children, Elena said quietly. Children who were taken from her backyard 40 years ago. The silence in the room was deafening. Ethan spoke first. That's impossible. We were adopted, but we weren't kidnapped. We were found abandoned. Our parents, our adoptive parents, they told us our biological parents had died. What if they were wrong? Elena asked. What if someone told them that story but it wasn't true? Eric shook his head. This is crazy. We have lives. Families. We're not some missing children from a 40-year-old case. Then prove it, Elena said. Take a DNA test. If there's no match, you can go on with your lives and I'll leave you alone. But if there is a match... She paused. Don't you want to know the truth? The brothers looked at each other. 40 years of believing one story. 40 years of building their lives on what they thought was their history. What about the woman? Evan asked quietly. What's she like? Elena pulled out her phone and showed them a recent photo of Margaret. An elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair, standing by a gate with 3 lit candles. She's never stopped looking for you, Elena said. Every single year for 40 years she's lit candles for you. She's kept your room. She's never given up hope. The brothers agreed to the test. 3 days later, Elena sat in her office staring at the results. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone to call Margaret. 99.8% match. After 40 years, the Marsh Triplets had... While Margaret processed the impossible news that her children were alive, Elena dug deeper into Howard Kettering's past. If the Palmer brothers were the Marsh Triplets, someone had taken them. Someone had kept them hidden for months. Someone had orchestrated their abandonment at that Sacramento hospital. She started with Helen Kramer, the social worker who disappeared. It took days of searching through old records, but Elena finally found what she was looking for. Helen Kramer was Howard Kettering's younger sister. The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Elena pulled everything she could find on Helen. She'd worked for Child Protective Services in Northern California. She'd had access to adoption networks, hospital records, and the ability to move children through the system without raising suspicion. Elena drove to Howard Kettering's old farmhouse. It had been abandoned for over 30 years, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The developer had given up long ago. Now it stood as a decaying monument to something dark and wrong. She pushed open the front door. It groaned on rusted hinges. Inside, everything was coated in dust and cobwebs. Dolls still sat on shelves, their glass eyes watching. Newspapers yellowed on tables. It was like stepping into a tomb. Elena searched methodically room by room. In what must have been Howard's study, she found journals. Dozens of them filled with his cramped, spidery handwriting. She sat on the dusty floor and began to read. The entries painted a picture of a deeply disturbed man who believed children were perfect beings corrupted by the world. He wrote about preservation, keeping children innocent forever by removing them from society. He wrote about his sister, Helen, who shared his beliefs. And then Elena found the entry dated August 14, 1986. Helen brought them today. 3 angels. Perfect. Identical. The mother left them unguarded as if she didn't understand their value. We've saved them from a life of mediocrity and moral decay. They'll stay with us until the time is right. Until we've taught them the truth about purity. Elena's stomach turned as she continued reading. For months, Howard wrote about the triplets. How he kept them in a hidden room in the basement. How he convinced them their mother had died. How he and Helen planned to keep them forever. But then, in early 1987, Howard's health declined. He had a heart attack. He couldn't care for the children anymore. Helen panicked. She says we have to let them go, Howard wrote. The authorities are still looking. We can't keep them here if I'm dying. She'll take them to Sacramento. Leave them somewhere safe. Tell them a story that will protect us both. The final entries were bitter, angry. Howard died believing he'd been forced to release his perfect collection. Elena closed the journal and called for a forensics team. In the basement, behind a wall that had been sealed with boards and plaster, they found the hidden room. Small beds, children's toys, and photographs. 3 toddlers in matching overalls, staring at the camera with confused, frightened eyes. On the back of one photo in Howard's handwriting, "My beautiful collection. Evan. Ethan. Allah." Margaret stood on the porch of Evan Palmer's house, trembling. Elena stood beside her, a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready?" Elena asked quietly. Margaret nodded. She wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for this moment. 40 years of grief. 40 years of wondering. And now, on the other side of that door were her children. Grown. With lives she knew nothing about. Strangers wearing the faces she dreamed of every night. The door opened. Evan stood there and Margaret's breath caught. She'd looked at his baby pictures so many times she'd memorized every detail. And now here he was, a middle-aged man with graying temples and laugh lines around his eyes. But she could still see the toddler underneath. Still see her little boy in red shoes. "Mrs. Marsh," he said quietly. His voice broke on her name. "Evan," she whispered. They stood there for a long moment, neither knowing what to do. How do you bridge 40 years? How do you become mother and son again after a lifetime apart? Ethan and Eric appeared behind their brother. 3 identical faces, all carrying the same expression of uncertainty and grief and something that might have been hope. Margaret started to cry. "I never stopped looking for you. Never. Not for a single day." Evan stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her. She barely reached his chest now. Her little boy who used to fit in her lap was holding her like she might break. Maybe she was breaking. Maybe that's what this moment required. Ethan and Eric joined them, and they all stood there on that porch, crying together for everything that had been stolen from them. Inside, over coffee that no one drank, the brothers told Margaret about their lives. They'd had good childhoods with the Palmers. Robert and Linda had loved them, raised them well, given them every opportunity. They'd grown up believing their biological parents had died in a car accident. That they'd been found wandering alone and saved. "We weren't saved," Ethan said quietly. "We were taken. From you." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "You were children. None of this was your fault." They showed her photos, birthdays, graduations, weddings. 40 years of moments she'd missed. 40 years of milestones she'd never see. Eric had 2 children. Ethan had 1. Evan had just gotten married last year. Margaret was a grandmother. She had a family she'd never known about. "I don't expect anything from you," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I know I'm a stranger to you. I know you have parents who raised you, who loved you. I'm not trying to replace them. She broke down. "I just want to know you. If you'll let me." Evan squeezed her hand. "We want that too." They talked for hours. About the day they were taken. The brothers had fragments of memories, dreamlike and disconnected. A dark room. A woman singing. The smell of pine trees. Fear they didn't understand. They talked about Howard and Helen, about the evil that had stolen their childhood. About Elena's discovery of the farmhouse and the journals that explained everything. Margaret told them about Thomas, their father who'd left and died 5 years ago without ever knowing his children were alive. About the decades she'd spent searching. About the candles she lit every year, whispering their names into the darkness. "We heard you," Evan said suddenly. "I don't know how, but somehow we heard you." 2 weeks after the reunion, Elena made one final discovery. She'd been tracking down every piece of information about Helen Kramer, trying to understand why a social worker would help her brother kidnap 3 children. She found Helen's body in an unmarked grave in a small cemetery outside of Portland. She'd been buried under a false name in 1988, just months after the triplets were found in Sacramento. But before she died, Helen had written a letter. Elena found it in a safety deposit box, along with documents and photographs that confirmed everything they'd already learned. The letter was addressed to no one in particular. A confession left behind by a dying woman who knew she'd never face justice. Elena read it to Margaret in her living room with the triplets present. "I'm writing this because someone should know the truth," Helen's letter began. "Not for redemption. There is no redemption for what I've done. But for understanding, perhaps. My brother Howard and I were raised in isolation. Our parents believed the world was corrupted, evil, beyond saving. They kept us locked away, taught us that innocence could only be preserved through separation from society. When they died, Howard became obsessed with the idea that he could save other children from the corruption we'd been saved from. He believed he could create a perfect family. Pure. Untouched. When I saw the Marsh Triplets that day, playing in their yard, so perfect, so identical, I knew Howard would see them as a sign. I helped him take them. I told myself I was saving them. I believed we were doing something noble. We kept them in the farmhouse for 5 months. Taught them that their mother had died. That the world outside was dangerous. Howard was patient with them. Gentle in his own twisted way. He truly believed he was protecting them. But then Howard got sick. His heart was failing. And I realized what we'd done. These children weren't symbols of purity. They were victims. We'd destroyed a family. We'd stolen lives. I couldn't let them die with Howard. I couldn't keep them prisoner. So I took them to Sacramento and left them at the hospital. I told myself someone would give them a good home. That they'd be better off not knowing where they came from. I was a coward. I should have returned them to their mother. I should have confessed everything. But I was afraid. So I ran. I'm dying now. Cancer. It's fitting, I suppose. My body finally rebelling against all the evil I've allowed it to do. To Margaret Marsh, I know you'll never read this, but I'm sorry. Those words are worthless, but they're all I have. Your children were beautiful. They deserved better than what we did to them. I hope somehow, someday you find peace. The letter ended there. Margaret sat in silence for a long time after Elena finished reading. Then she looked at her sons, her grown middle-aged children, and said quietly, "She was right about one thing. You did deserve better. But you're here now. That's what matters." The story broke nationally 3 months later. For weeks, every news outlet covered the miracle reunion. The triplets taken in 1986 and found 40 years later. Alive. Well, changed forever but still here. Margaret declined most interview requests. She'd spent 40 years in the public eye, her grief on display for everyone to see. Now she wanted privacy. Time with her sons. Time to build something new from the ruins of what had been stolen. The brothers struggled in their own ways. Evan started therapy to process the revelation that his entire childhood had been built on a lie. Ethan became obsessed with understanding what had happened, reading Howard's journals, trying to find meaning in the senseless. Eric was the angriest. He'd lost 40 years with his biological mother. His adoptive parents, who'd passed away years ago, had unknowingly raised kidnapped children. Everything felt tainted. But slowly, over months and then years, they began to heal. Or at least they learned how to carry the weight of what had happened. Margaret moved to Oregon to be closer to them. She met her grandchildren, beautiful kids who called her Nana Margaret, and had no idea how much their existence meant to her. She had Sunday dinners with her sons. Helped babysit. Attended school plays and soccer games. She got to be a mother again, even if it wasn't the way she'd imagined 40 years ago. The Marsh case became a symbol of hope in the true crime community. Proof that even the coldest cases could be solved. That families could be reunited. That sometimes, impossibly, there were happy endings. But Margaret knew better. This wasn't a happy ending. Too much had been lost. Too much time stolen. Thomas was gone. The triplets' childhood with her was gone. 40 years of memories they should have made together were gone. This wasn't happy. It was just something. A consolation prize from a universe that had taken everything and then, decades later, given back a small piece. But it was enough. It had to be enough. Margaret Marsh passed away peacefully in her sleep on August 14, 2031, exactly 45 years after her children were taken. She was 78 years old. She died in a house surrounded by photographs of her sons, her grandchildren, and the life she'd managed to build in the 5 years after they'd been found. On her nightstand was the same photograph she'd carried for 40 years, 3 toddlers in her lap wearing red, blue, and yellow shoes. The funeral was held on a sunny morning in Oregon. Evan, Ethan, and Eric stood at the front of the church, holding each other up as they'd done their entire lives, and said goodbye to the mother they'd lost twice. "She never gave up," Evan said in his eulogy. "For 40 years, when everyone else moved on, when the world forgot about us, she kept searching. She kept hoping. And because she did, we got 5 years with her. 5 years we never should have had." He paused, his voice breaking. It wasn't enough time. Could never be enough time. But it was everything. They buried her in Dunsmuir, next to the empty plot where Thomas lay. The headstone read, "Margaret Marsh, 1948 to 2031. Beloved mother." She never stopped searching. At the grave they placed 3 candles and lit them as the sun set. Red, blue, yellow. And as the flames flickered in the evening breeze, 3 grown men whispered 3 names into the wind, just as their mother had done for 40 years. Evan, Ethan, Allah. Some stories don't have endings. They just have moments. Moments when the searching stops. Moments when the lost are found. Moments when a mother finally gets to rest. This was Margaret Marsh's moment. And it was enough.